Hey YouTube, what's going on? Welcome back to the 2024 Outdoor Cannabis Garden Tour series. It's been approximately 17 days since the previous outdoor gardening vlog, and this is the 6th garden update of the 2024 season. Really quick update today, so let's jump right into it. The weather has been pretty hot, in between the mid to high 90s, sometimes even reaching into the hundreds. Starting off with our first plant, this is our creamy greasies, and this plant is not looking super happy. There is some extreme leaf curling towards the top of the plant, sometimes called tacoing, just from the shape of the leaves. It gets the sort of name, but it's pretty drastic. You can see it's kind of like clawing, trying to close itself from getting direct sunlight, so it's not looking really happy. You can also notice there's some leaf discoloration on the fan leaves. Initially I thought this might be due to a leaf fungus, but I haven't been able to notice any active infection sites. So this may be due to some sort of pest like an insect. But yeah, this plant is not looking super happy. The branches do seem somewhat perky still, but definitely not a good look. Moving on to our next plant in the garden, this is a unicorn heaven. A couple times I've mistakenly referred to this as a purple unicorn, but it's actually a unicorn heaven. And this plant has survived, thankfully, although it's not looking super great right now. You can see, especially towards the tops of the plants, there's some leaf curling or tacoing, and overall it's a lot of the branches are just leaning over at awkward angles and whatnot, so it's not looking super great. I've uncovered this plant for about 7 days, so she's been without the umbrella that I initially used to shade her for a couple days, but I think I'm planning on topping the plant because these tops look not super great. And I think some of the lower growth looks a little bit better, so if I'm able to shape the plant by topping it and removing key branches, I think the plant will look a lot better in terms of its overall shape. Moving on to our next plant, we have our Skittle Mittens, and this plant is looking really good, thankfully. No issues to report. She's looking pretty perky, no signs of leaf curling or anything like that, which is good to see because this is one of my favorite plants from last year. This was probably my favorite strain of last year. Moving on to our next plant in the garden, this is our Pure Michigan F4, and this plant is not looking good at all. You can see this plant is kind of topped over. It's not looking perky at all. It looks like there's probably some issues with the roots. I wouldn't be surprised if this plant also is suffering from some strain of root fungi, but not looking super happy. Initially this plant was pretty vigorous and it had a deep dark green color to it. I wouldn't be surprised if this plant died before the next garden update, although I definitely hope that's not the case. I wanted to grow this strain specifically out, and it's really sad to see this plant like this. Moving on to our next plant in the garden, we have our GSD F5 from Copa Genetics, and this plant is thankfully looking pretty good. No issues with the leaf curling or anything like that. No discoloration of the fan leaves. Really vigorous and bushy growth. The growth kind of reminds me of a plant that I grew a couple years back, I think called Chronic Haze from VIP Seeds. Very bushy plant. I should probably prune it and remove some of the growth because it is looking very bushy. Stems are very thin. Very interesting growth pattern. Moving on to our next plant in the garden. This is our Meltdown F1, one of my favorite strains from last season. And thankfully this plant is looking really good as well. No leaf discoloration. There's some slight leaf curling towards the top of the plant, but I don't think this is too significant. It's looking really good, and I hope she finishes up well. Very beautiful plant. Moving on to our next plant in the garden. This is a Chernobyl S1, and the previous plant died from root rot. Basically within the course of about 3 days, it's completely wilted and all the fan leaves yellowed from the bottom up, and it basically just looks super droopy and wilted. So I pulled her out of the soil, and it was really easy. A lot of the roots were broken and completely colonized by the fungus. So I was able to put this tiny plant in here. Instead, this is the same strain, so it's another Chernobyl S1, and I don't anticipate getting any meaningful harvest from this tiny plant, but I did want to put her in here just to see if this plant also was colonized by root rot like the previous one was. But moving on to our next plant in the garden, this is another Chernobyl S1, and this is about the size of the previous one. This one is looking a lot better, thankfully. There's some slight leaf curling towards the top of the plant, which I am a little bit worried about. Initially I thought it might be the initial signs of root rot, which it may actually be, but I'm suspecting now that it's probably related to our weather this year. This year our weather has been extremely hot, and for most of the summer it's been extremely arid, so we haven't received a ton of rain like in previous years. Over the previous 17 days we have received some rain, so that's a good sign, but in the 8 to 10 years that I've been gardening, I haven't really seen a summer like this where it's been quite so hot and quite so dry. But hopefully this Chernobyl does well and doesn't succumb to any diseases. This strain is one that I specifically have wanted to grow for quite a long time, so I'm hoping that I'm able to get her through the flowering and everything like that, but we'll have to see. Moving on to our next plant in the garden, this is our second Skittle Mittens, and this one isn't quite so tall or lanky as the previous one, although the location here is better in terms of light than the location that the other Skittle Mittens is in. I've been able to spread the canopy out a little bit, which is looking pretty good. Hopefully I'm able to have this plant grow a little bit more, because I'd like to get a nice harvest from her. But I like the way I'm shaping her canopy, and I'm thankful that this plant isn't seeing many issues. I damaged the roots a little bit when I moved her over here, swapping her location with the Unicorn Heaven, but I think she has since recovered, and the damage to the roots wasn't nearly as significant as compared to the Unicorn Heaven's roots. But hopefully she does well. This location right here is really good for sun because the fence isn't quite so high back here. And moving on to our final plant in the garden, this is our slime ball, or one of the seeds I found from the slime ball, the single seed actually I found from the slime ball. And when I did a stem rub, she smelled pretty much exactly like the original slime ball did. I remember the slime ball had really light colored leaves, really light lime colored leaves. This plant here seems to have darker colored leaves, but in terms of the stem rub, she smells exactly like the slime ball. So I'm not quite sure if that plant feminized itself or whatnot, but this plant has been growing quite a bit, and I wouldn't be surprised if this was one of the bigger plants towards the end of the season, just seeing as she's getting really good light back here and she's growing really rapidly. But I hope she does really well. This is one of my most anticipated plants aside from the Skittle Mittens and the Chernobyl, so we'll have to see what happens. But that's about it for this garden update. Just wanted to keep you guys updated with how the garden is looking. A lot of things have changed since the last garden update, and I think there'll probably be more changes by the time I film the next garden update in about 2 weeks. So look out for that around the 1st of August. But yeah, this season has definitely been one of the more difficult ones. The weather's been really hot and dry, and I'm seeing a lot of issues with a lot of my plants, so definitely not my best year. But thank you so much for tuning in, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Later.